Hey, Zaka family. Zaka is launching an exclusive membership platform to provide you with career development workshops, coaching, community, and so much more. Go to ZakaConnect.com and sign up to receive information on how to access early registration and perks. Hello, everybody. This is Paul Herman, the Prince of Motivation and host of Zaka Presents My Journey. We're creating this vulnerable and positive platform where you can get inspired and motivated from different leaders from our community. Today, our guest is Kevin Moore, who is the founder and managing partner of Serac Ventures. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is all ours. Kevin, I'm very excited to have you on. You are our first guest from the VC world. And I know that our listeners are going to be looking to hear a lot more about that and what you do. But before we get into what you do currently and your journey, could you just let us know a little bit more about your cultural background and where you grew up?
So I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and of a Jamaican heritage. My father actually met my mother in Jamaica when he was there for something. I think he was there on some church-related matters, and they fell in love. And then they wrote each other for a year letters, not text, not Twitter, nothing like that. Handwritten letters for back and forth from the States to Jamaica. And ultimately they got married and she came to the United States. And I grew up in a Jamaican household. Great food.
Oh, that is right. That culture, the Jamaican culture. I'm also Jamaican as well, too. Half Jamaican,
Awesome.
half St. Lucian. So it's always good to know there's another yard man. I know. Yadi hunting.
Yard man.
Yes, kid. The food is always good. You know, I know people be battling sometimes and saying other islands got some good food, but I think Jamaica holds it down.
It does. I think that was probably the most challenging part. My wife is from America, and I've always said to her, man, if you could ever learn to cook Jamaican food, that would just be like a man, like my dream come true. But
don't worry, they got some recipe books out there somewhere. You go
right,
start going to Barnes and Nobles and find it.
Right.
What would like go on? What you gonna say?
I was gonna say not the same, but we continue.
Oh, true. That is true. And this brings me to the next question right now. I want to know, like, what were some of the lessons that you learned as in your childhood that kind of helped you today? I mean, obviously growing up in a Caribbean household, I know there's a lot of that strong heritage and like pushing and driving and stuff like that. But what are some of the lessons that you learned?
You know, there's often a stereotype that Jamaicans work a lot of jobs. And I wouldn't say that they're all false, but I never really saw that. It was more so we were always busy working on something. And while you had your full-time job, there was always some sort of side hustle that everyone in the family always had, especially my uncles. My uncle Bobby, Robert Frazier, I mean, he worked for AT&T by day, kind of installing, at the time, mobile phones into cars, but he was always working on something else, whether it was working on cars or installing some electrical equipment somewhere. That was just what we sort of grew up around. So everyone always was hustling and doing things. Even my grandfather, who they still maintain their house and a church in Jamaica, but they always had side businesses. So I know growing up, learning about him, while he was running that church, he was also a truck driver, worked for a trucking company, and they used to ship goods back and forth between Jamaica and Cuba, and they would take ferry over there, and he would drive. And I didn't learn this until later, but he was also fluent in Spanish, which I speak Spanish now, self-taught, right? And
let's get it.
I never knew that he had that sort of background, but growing up, it was just a culture of hard work. And my mom always used to tell me, it's better to try and fail than to not try at all. And that's sort of my mentality with how I go through life.
That's very big right there. You know, sometimes people get a little nervous and worried and they're like, I don't know if I want to try it, but you never know. You never
Yeah.
know. And you are right about that Jamaican
I actually
culture.
have a story. About that whenever we get to it. But that one piece of advice really motivated me to make a huge career transition shift. That if I had not listened to that advice, I wouldn't be where I'm at today.
See, our parents always knew what was best for us. You
Right?
know, they would say, they would speak in metaphors, the Caribbean culture, and you'd be standing there like, what you said? It don't make no sense. But, 10 years later, you're like, oh, you know what? That made perfect sense. That made perfect sense.
Right?
Now, I know growing up as a child, there are always those challenges in someone's life, right? What were like some of the few challenges that you had to deal with as in your childhood that kind of shape you professionally in your journey?
I used to be really ashamed to talk about some of the challenges that my brother and I experienced growing up. My parents divorced when I was probably 5 or 6, and we ended up living with my father. And after that divorce, things were pretty tough. My dad ended up losing a job. We ended up losing our house. Then we were homeless for a little bit, living in sort of a back house of a friend of his. And it was tough. That was a tough time. I think the entirety of my fourth and almost half of my fifth grade spent living in those conditions. And I always try to tell myself, everybody at some point, if they're if they have went through hard times, have went through something difficult. But I remember those days vividly, from there not being a bathroom there, not being heating and air in that facility, and feeling embarrassed with my friends at school who wanted to come over and play, telling them I couldn't. I mean, we were legitimately without a lot of resources. But I think that was it's something now that I embrace, and especially as I've worked in venture capital, and there's a Frida Kapor at Kapor Capital in San Francisco. I was at a conference and she was talking about this sort of subjective metric that she uses to gauge with some entrepreneurs. She called it the distance traveled metric. And she said that, where people are in life is not a function of sort of the things that they've accomplished on their own. It's a function of, a lot of things that they've had to overcome. And she said that I would rather work with someone who's overcome a tremendous amount of obstacles to get where they are versus someone who's at the same point but didn't have to overcome as much. So again, I vividly remember that particular period of my life, and then some others. But I always think, man, my distance traveled metric in comparison to other people who do what I do, I think mine is pretty high. But again, I don't know everyone else's story. All I know is mine.
Mm-hmm. Well, you definitely did come up on top. And you said fourth and fifth grade. That's pretty young, to be
Yeah,
going to that.
I was probably, how are you in the fifth grade? 10 or 12, 10,
Yeah,
11?
yeah. I was gonna say, yeah. And obviously this is when you want to socialize and hang out with your friends. And like you said, you could tell them like you can't come over, and then to finding other ways of still being active in school, but knowing that when you go home, those issues will arise again. And to stay focused, at that young, you had to really, you know, be that much stronger inside internally to really process that and really still manifest your dreams and still pursue what you want to do.
Well, the thing is, in hindsight, it's easy to say that. But when you're going through it, and I think when kids are going through situations like that, you kind of just sort of, it's not great, but at the same time, you don't know of any other option. I mean, you might see your friends or people around you living a certain way, but you kind of learn to just sort of deal with what you have. I mean, kids, I think, are the most resilient people out there, and quite frankly, more resilient than some adults. And I think that going through those periods in my life was more like we just had to do it. And that was one sort of phase. And then the next phase was we moved to a pretty bad neighborhood and seeing a lot of crime and people getting jumped and people running through the neighborhood with weapons and shootings and just all those different things. I mean, I wouldn't say you get used to it, but you certainly get to a point to where you can just, I wouldn't say it becomes a regular part of the day, but you do kind of get used to it. And you still know it's not good. You just don't like it. But what else can I do? It's not like I could leave the situation. And I think for a time, the way that my brother, who roughly 12 or 13 months older than I am, he responded to the divorce and to the situation differently than I did. I think I had the benefit of being the younger sibling who saw the decisions he made and saw the decisions some of my father made. And I had the privilege of, I won't say privilege, but I was fortunate enough to be able to observe that and see the outcome of their decisions and think, man, I would like to try to do something different. I want to do the opposite of that. So it was kind of like a reverse role model effect where I've never, for a large part of my life, I was never motivated by people who were successful. I was always motivated by not wanting to mess up and see and repeat the mistakes that everyone else around me was making. That's not really a good way. That's not really a good way to live your life. I will say that. I've moved away from that, but for a time, I was always motivated by failure than success.
Mm-hmm. To know that at a young age, I mean, again, you that story alone and being able to think like that. Now, what was like some of your aspirations as a child, like growing up? Like as you're going through all of this, did you know that you want to be in finance or in the VC sector world?
I did not. I was curious. I wanted to be an engineer. I was very into art and drawing, and I thought I could translate that into, building things. Curiosity led me to think, man, with all this curiosity, maybe I should be an engineer because I always wanted to know how things worked. And that's what I did. I originally wanted to be an architect. And when I got into college, I realized that wasn't the path that I should take, but engineering was sort of that path. I actually didn't get interested in finance until my very last year in college, just from, again, curious about numbers. And I was good at math and started reading about investing. And interesting story, I visited a church with my wife, I guess my girlfriend at the time, now wife. And I met this pastor, and he was just like, "Man, you should work in finance." He said that to me, and I think that popped my interest. But what that led to, and sort of what I realized later, this is when we actually left the state of Oklahoma. I was living in Chicago. I really, really dove into finance and started thinking how much of a difference it was making in my life just from saving and investing. And I started doing a lot of that stuff on my own. And then I thought, man, I'm doing fairly well for myself. Perhaps I could do that for other people. And that's what sort of, that was the transition point.
I see. Now, what was it like after graduating from Oklahoma State? Like, I know that you went back for your MBA as well, too. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Graduation was, I felt like my chance to sort of chart my own path and sort of the chains were off and I could do whatever I wanted to do. And within a week of graduating, I'd left. Part of leaving where I grew up was intentional, but also a way of, I wouldn't call it escape, but just a chance to sort of start over, right? And build my life the way I wanted it. And I did that. We left school. I mean, I was living in Chicago less than a week after graduating. We had we went to church, and I had a new job, and we were making new friends, and I was just creating this entire new identity. And I still think at that time, while I was building relationships, not many people knew who I was. I would say very few knew who I was, because I purposefully left a lot of that part of my identity behind, and I just didn't want to embrace it. And I still, like, even this interview, I still feel odd talking about it, because it's like, when I always think about the future and try to stay positive and like working hard to, I always try to work hard to, in some cases, just distract myself from some of those things that I was telling you earlier. But for a long time, being in Chicago and being out of school was like this defining point of like, all right, I'm going to create who I want to be, and nothing's going to stop me.
And what were like some of those struggles you faced after your education, like trying to identify your career path?
I think that imposter syndrome is very real, and when you come from like my background, and where you're like the first person to go to college, and I imagine that a lot of people listening to this feel the same way. It's like, you're probably the first person to go to college. You're the first person to do a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And
True.
You're entering into environments where the majority of people haven't experienced what you've experienced. So I think wrestling through the emotional and psychological components of that is like very real. And I think that you guys are really onto something with these type of conversations, because I think it does resonate with a lot of people in that regard. Because again, I don't think I'm unique. It's just more so, it's a really good question around, how do you continue to strive towards success despite all those things? It's now motivation, but it was an issue for a while.
Mm-hmm. And what helped you get through that? And now you're talking about these struggles, you're talking about a lot of these transitions, from school to the divorce to, college, all these things are happening. But as you could see through your story, there's is beauty in the story. Like, every time you kept moving forward, something new came into you, right? You came into a new place to live. You getting married, you're graduating, things kept on coming. But what kept you motivated to keep moving forward?
I think, like, number one, I've always believed that if wherever I was there for a purpose. And I feel like for me, I find my purpose in God, and finding like strength in that sort of one thing that never changes. And I felt like if I got through all that, then God has me where I'm at for a reason. And I've always sort of anchored myself on that, regardless of what was happening around me. So I don't want to take credit for things that I had no control over. I think there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad, but most people like don't choose the bad things that happen to them. And to a certain extent,
yeah,
when something really good happens to them, people want to claim they take credit for it, when really it could have just been a blessing. And I don't want to be the type of person who's like, oh, I worked so hard and all these things and all these great things. Like, no, I give full credit for the blessing from God for everything that I have right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think this is something that as a VC, I talk about too. The reason why like we build portfolios of companies is because we don't know which one of those companies will be successful. We know that the probability is that a few of them will, but we don't know which ones at the beginning. And it sometimes bothers me when I see some people in the industry take like all this credit for these companies that succeed, and it's like they knew the whole time. I'm like, you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about my life the same way. It's like the only thing I can control is I can wake up and do my work and stick to the fundamentals and accept the good along with the bad. And hopefully over the long term, that works out well. And I think that for me, as I've lived like a life of faith that way, my faith has never went up or down. It's always been the same because I don't look at the outcome of how things turn out to determine how faithful I'm going to be for something. Does that make sense?
You better drop a gem right now. You better drop some gems right now. Whew, you better come on. That was very deep, and I appreciate you sharing that. Because I know a lot of times when people are going through stuff, it's very hard to kind of get out of it. But there's, like you said, you got to believe in a higher power. Whatever it is, besides yourself to kind of get you there. But I like how you said you kept it neutral. You didn't, no matter what blessing came your way, what struggle came your way, you kept it even along the way. And you mentioned a key word in that. You said the key word VC, right? And I know some of our listeners are probably like, VC, what they talking about? VC, right? For the people, the audience that don't know, can you explain a little bit more about what VC does and how they help founders?
So venture capitalists invest in typically early stage, high growth companies, usually in the technology sector, because those are companies that are easy to scale, meaning that you can put a little bit of money into a company that doesn't require like a tons of hard assets or tremendous amount of sort of dollars in order to create like an exponential outcome. So venture capitalists is an industry where they are usually the people who are accepting the most risk and accepting a high failure rate when they invest into a company, because they're hoping that one or two or three of those companies provides like a 20 or 30x return on their investment to make up for all of the investments that didn't succeed prior. I think that among asset classes, you have your venture capital, which is like the risky dollars. Then you have private equity, which are dollars that go to more mature companies that are still private. And then you have your public companies that you can just invest in the stock market or in your mutual fund or whatever. But VC used to be like a cottage industry, like really small, and now it's evolved into like a multi-billion-dollar industry across the world.
I agree with you on that. It's definitely growing and it's getting a lot more exposure. And I'm glad you kind of broke it down to the our audience members. Now I know in your profession there's a lot of connection, right? There's a lot of networking across the board, and you gotta I want to say connect with a very diverse group of people. Like, how do you successfully like navigate the landscape and finding those individuals and those partnerships, meaningful partnerships, if anything?
I think that navigating the landscape comes with understanding how it works and how it's structured. There are layers to it, right? Think about like a target, like a bullseye, like the target symbol, like that inner core of the circle is, say, you. And then or let me say it differently. Let's just the startup financing center of the universe. When you move out to each concentric circle, there's layers. Like if you're raising money for a company, the first people you talk to are your family and friends. Great. You need $200,000. If you go to the people you know and you can get that money. The next circle out are organized angel investment groups. And angel investors are typically higher net worth people who are investing their own money into startup companies. And what they will do is they'll organize groups of 25, 50 people who meet on a regular basis to look at deals. They're not professional investors, but they have more money to invest than your family and friends. And then one step above that is where you start to enter into venture capital, where you have your pre-seed, seed, et cetera, and then so on to PE and public markets. But I talk about that because when you think about navigating the sort of environment of investing in private markets, understanding each of those layers will help you sort of navigate like, hey, if I'm raising money for a company and I need $100,000, well, then you're probably not going to go talk to a venture capital. You're probably going to want to get connected to an angel group or your family and friends. So for my industry, when I'm thinking about finding different investment opportunities or looking for co-investors or even looking for founders, depending on the stage that I'm looking at, I'll know which one of those sort of rings within the circle to start either marketing to or attending events or reaching out to people on LinkedIn and my network and start sort of building those relationships. Because now that I've been in the VC space for almost 10 years, I have a number of people that I know in the industry. If I just need advice or access to deals or access to other investors, it's more of that did not come overnight, but it is something that I've learned how to navigate fairly well.
Now, was that something that came about when you were a financial advisor at Morgan Stanley, and I know you were at Northwestern Mutual as well? Did those days, those early days, influence you?
Yeah. So I just to clear things up for the audience. So after I got my degree in engineering, I worked that job for 2 years, and then I went to work in finance as a financial advisor, wanting to help people with their investments, et cetera. So I did that for 4 years at Northwestern Mutual and then 2 years at Morgan Stanley. And that's when I went back to school to get my MBA. And during that time, I was working at the Federal Reserve Bank as a bank examiner before I went to work at a firm called I2E, which is where I first got my start investing in early stage technology companies. And then I went to work on the LP side as a partner at a venture capital fund of funds manager before starting Serac Ventures. So having that sort of color across the financial industry sort of informed me with how to sort of navigate through things for sure. But it wasn't just one place. It was really a culmination of all those different areas.
Now, the transition from engineering to financing is like a unique journey overall, right? You know, if you're an engineer and you said you want to look into, at one point, looking into being an architect, and then you switch over in the finance world and, you know, into investment, you know, how did you leverage like your civil engineering degree to then move into that financial role?
Engineers are really good at solving problems. And I always thought that, right?
No, 100%. You're right. And they would stare at something forever. My brother, he was a civil engineering major, and that was something he enjoyed doing. And I would be like, bro, it's over. Like, it's over. Leave that alone. Leave that alone. He's like, no, I like solving these things.
Well, I tell you, it's a blessing and a curse. And I think that you can do that to an extent. And I actually had to learn how to not do that. And people always thought, man, it's going to be hard for you to transition from thinking like that. But that wasn't the part of in being an engineer that I embraced and I feel like I took over. But in addition to solving problems, engineers are also really good at like process mapping. And when I think about the application of what I learned as an engineer, is not so much, yes, the ability to break down problems as it relates to whatever it is, whether it's business, whether it's marketing or whatever, but also creating processes for things such as like, hey, here's the map of how we're going to do this. And if it's a business, for example, one of the things we talk about is finding like positive unit economics in a business. And basically what that means is if you can figure out a way to repeatedly make money, then how do you build a process to make sure that it happens every single time? And when I think about the application of that to companies, that's one thing I'm always thinking about, like, what's your process for doing X, Y, or Z? So that sort of framework for solving problems comes from understanding the process. And I always talk about this like with my daughter, who she doesn't love math. And I always tell her like, man, to me, math was the most straightforward subject in school because there was very little subjectivity in it.
That is correct. One of our previous guests, not to cut you off on it, but one of our previous guests said exactly those words. Said you can't. 1 + 1 is 2. There's no question. There's no argument. There's no back and forth. There's no gray area. So math is definitely. That's why he was like, I forgot it. I think he did something in finance, but he said that's why he moved into that direction because he said he couldn't do the back and forth stuff.
Yeah, I love math for that reason, and I will tell you though, sometimes in the market of VC, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. But and I mean that from the standpoint of like sometimes things that don't make sense, like how in the world are certain companies super successful? The market changes, and then sometimes I think how in the world did some other companies fail? And it's like sometimes I wouldn't say that that's the norm, but for the most part, that's what I've appreciated about sort of the carryover from what I was trained to do as an engineer to how I think about things as a VC is the processes and just the ability to sit down and think about how does this work? How can I get to a solution?
Mm. And I know in the VC world and in other places in corporate America, this is something that we always talk about and try to just obviously want to hear your opinion on it, is the lack of diversity, right? And I want to kind of hear your opinion on speaking a little bit more on the lack of diversity in the VC world, and like with the lack of like minority founders getting investment opportunities. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
The VC industry, in my opinion, is probably the least diverse industry of industries. But understanding why was important for me, and I think it's important for everyone. It's like, for the most part, the industry was started by technologists years ago, back in like the 1940s. And at that time, obviously, the United States was very segregated, very white male dominated. And whenever companies within that industry early on were successful, the people within those networks were the ones who benefited from those rewards. And then that just perpetuated itself. And the hard part about venture capital, and the reason why like venture capital firms have so much difficulty scaling themselves, is because so much of what they do is network driven, in that if they need to hire someone, they're going to call one of their friends. If they're looking to invest in a company, they usually find their best opportunities by someone who refers that company to them. So when you compound that over decades, you start to see an industry that's very homogenous, very insular, very network driven, and I mean this not just by ethnicity, I'm talking about by geography, even by the types of companies and founders that they're looking at. And I actually wrote a white paper internally. I haven't actually published this yet, about how technology has made it so much easier for people to actually start a company, especially with like AWS and the cost of server space going way down. No code, low code technology making it so much easier for people to come up with an idea and build that. Well, that's led to, over the last 10 or 15 years, and a huge wave of entrepreneur entering the market, not just on the coast, but all over the country, in markets like mine, markets throughout the Midwest, Southeast, Southwest. And then in that new class of founder are women and people of color building amazing companies. So for me, it's like, when you think about like less than 1% of venture capital goes to like Black founders, and less than 3% goes to women and people of color, including Black in general. And you're like, okay, well, in 2022, there was close to $250 billion invested into by VCs, and only 3% of that's going to those founders. Like, that's a problem. Not only is that a problem, but it presents an enormous opportunity for firms like mine who are saying, hey, we will open the doors to all talented people. And I think that's an advantage for like my firm. And again, I'm not the only one like this, but to my firm, they're saying, hey, if you're a talented person, we could care less about your ethnicity or your gender.
Let's get
We
it.
want to talk to you.
Yeah, let's get it. Let's get it. If it makes sense, it makes sense, you know?
If it makes sense, it makes sense. And I think for a long time, these founders have not had a seat at the table. And quite frankly, like I was saying earlier, like I said, I wouldn't say I'm an opportunist, but I do think that I would rather work with someone who kind of like me, where they've had to overcome so many obstacles just to have a seat at the table. I'll take that founder all day because I know that they're going to work their butts off and they're not going to be dismayed when they encounter challenges and problems. And they're just going to keep going and keep fighting because they've had to do that just to get in front of me.
Yeah. Just and if you think about it too, like just imagine the amount of years and experience, these people acquire, by doing that. So you're right. It's harder to back away and there's a lot of money on the line too. If you finally got to that place in time where someone's willing to invest in your company, hey, look, it's time to put up some more. If you thought you was working back then, start working even more. Right. So I give it to you, and I give it to your firm as well too for just giving an opportunity to people that probably would never have that opportunity, to sit at that table and share like, hey, look, this is my company, this is what I'm looking to do, and you guys have the ability to say yay and nay.
And it's crazy though. There's been like a surge of funds sort of trying to tackle this problem when it comes to like money going to diverse founders and immigrants and just people of color in general. And while it seems like we're making progress, like it's still such a small dent in the bigger number that, people say, how do you source deals and how are you getting access to the opportunities? And I wish the better question would be, man, given that you have a wide aperture for accepting what was once a completely closed off group of founders, how are you even handling the amount of deal flow that you're getting? To me, that would be a better question.
Come on. Yeah.
Because there's like so many like of these hungry entrepreneurs and passionate entrepreneurs. I've never had the chance to talk to a VC that I'm not kidding you, the deal flow is very robust. But for the firms that sort of dominate the fundraising environment, they're the ones, they're not looking at these founders. At least they're not looking at them as much. So I feel like that's the better question. Just like, man, Kevin, given that you are looking at diverse founders and women, like how are you handling the deal flow, not how are you getting deal flow?
And with that being said, like you're with your cultural background, the things that you've gone through in your life, schooling and as well too, right? You have access to a lot of like information that potentially could help in a potential investment. Like, could you tell us a little bit more about like how your cultural background could provide you with like distinct, insight that potentially an investor and would kind of overlook at some point?
I mean, a really good example is into a company that I was referred to called Solo Funds, and I ended up investing in the company. But these two guys started this company, Travis and Rodney. Their idea initially was to build a peer-to-peer lending network where individual lenders who had extra cash and individual borrowers who needed cash could borrow and lend money to each other in small dollar increments. And these two guys built this company based upon the market environment that they grew up in. And growing up, they said that, people would typically have to go to get a payday loan, or they were getting turned down for loans from the bank. And banks typically don't like to lend in this area because it's historically not been profitable. But when they were talking about those types of people who need $200 to get their tire fixed, or they need $50 to $100 because they have some small bill pop up, I'm just like, man, I know that market because I grew up around a lot of people like that. So they didn't have to explain it to me. I just got it. And it's I think a really strong example of when you have a broader and more diverse base of investors that can understand some of the challenges that certain entrepreneurs are solving for based upon markets that have been historically been underserved. Then you can start to understand how they're coming up with creative solutions to build products that serve those customers that were previously underserved. And that company has absolutely crushed it. And they had told me that when they were first starting to approach venture capitalists, that it took a long time for them to educate some VCs about this market and why it was substantial, because it's just because they just didn't get it. They didn't come from that place. So I think that having a diverse background and even understanding, like, what's the path of an immigrant? Like, how do they think about navigating things in this country? Or what's it like to come from an underserved market? And is there opportunity there? I'm going to listen to that story because I get it.
And I'm glad you are taking that opportunity to sit with somebody and hear this. Because even if it doesn't work out, I know that the conversation that you're sharing with them is also going to give them some insight to kind of walk away and say, you know what? It didn't work out, but Kevin definitely put me in the right direction. Gave me some good, valuable tips and some pointers that could help me out for the next time. Do you allow people to come back?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I never my mentality is, how do I add value every single time? And I feel like the biggest value I can add is just being honest with people. It's like, hey, this isn't going to work because you got to do this differently or do that differently. And if it is something that I can help with, great. If it's not, then I can try to point people in the right direction. But the world of VC is like that. Not every single company is going to raise the capital that they need. And it's just a matter of how I use this platform to be a resource in whatever way I can. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm. Now, with your background, you have a large background in finance, investment landscape. Like, how do you stay adaptable and like forward thinking, especially like considering like, technology and like all these market trends?
I think most people in this business are constantly talking to people, attending conferences. I read a lot, and part of that is intentional, just to understand like what is happening with technology. Now, I don't think anybody knows 100% what technology is going to be the one that sort of takes off. But I think, before I got into this industry, I never really thought about like what's coming next, or how can technology be applied to certain industries, or some of these newer industries like the creator economy, and what's stuff that's happening with AI and space exploration and future of work and all those different things. Like, most people are like not thinking about that. And quite frankly, and even with all the stuff that was happening with like blockchain and Web3 and all those things. And one thing I said to somebody was, I was like, the average person, they do not care about any of that stuff that I just said, all those categories. all they care about is does something work, right? No one, like when you walk into a room and flip on the light switch, you're not thinking of, I wonder how that works and how do I get power on. You just want to know that the light switch.
The light turned on. That's right. Come on now. That's it. That's it. But that's the engineering you right there.
Right.
You want to know.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that you want to know how it turns on. You're like, all right, where's this connected to, right? You're probably that person at dinner that's sitting there at a dinner table. Everyone's having good conversation. You're staring at everything like, yep, that right there is connected to that, and that provides that, and you're like just looking at everything, and it's like, Kevin, you here with us? Yeah, I'm here. Just looking around, just observing my surroundings real quick.
Yeah, and I think that most VCs are kind of like that. They're just curious about like how does that work, and who are the companies that driving that or making that, and looking at things like an investment opportunity. So when I think about new technology, I know that I need to stay aware of like all these different things that are happening, because they are the things that make people's lives hopefully better. But I think the average person is just, and again, I'm not saying that because VCs or even anyone who has interest think about the stuff that they're better. I just feel like it's my job to always be in the know about what's happening with technologies. Therefore, I stay abreast of that.
Mm-hmm. And with your career path, like we're talking about, 17 plus years. 17 plus
Yeah.
years of experience in finance and investing. Could you talk about like a moment that led you to establish your business?
You know, it wasn't until I started working at my last firm where I started. At my last firm, we had the opportunity to invest both in venture capital firms and also into investment, like co-investments into direct companies with some of those VC firms. And it really wasn't until I was there that I started to see this enormous opportunity of targeting founders that traditionally were not getting venture capital. Because I was spending a lot of time on the road, mainly in San Francisco, like the Bay Area. And when you go to some place so much, you really start to understand the rhythm of a place and how it works and how people think and where the opportunities are. Sorry about that, the phone ringing. That was really, there was a turning point like right pandemic, where I said, it's like, man, there's a big hole in the market for dollars going to more diverse people, and just geographically. So I thought, going back to when I was an engineer in Chicago, I remember sitting at my desk. This was in 2006, and I wrote myself an email, and it was an email of all these things I wanted to do by the time I turned certain ages. And one of them was start my own venture capital firm. And I still have that email in my inbox. I keep it there and I read it every now and then. But I talk about that because, one, it's a reminder of like the power of writing down your goals. And then the other is like, what are the skills that I need in order to make that happen? And I knew that it would happen at some point, but the moment in time where I wrote it down, I knew I wasn't ready for that to happen. So all the places I've worked, I knew that there was something I could take away from there in order to ultimately spin out and do something on my own. But it really wasn't until I saw what was happening in the venture capital industry in more detail that I became like extremely motivated to think, okay, I've accumulated all this knowledge. I've built up this network. I understand what it takes to run and operate a fund. Now I feel like I'm ready. And I think that the pandemic, catalyzed that tremendously for a lot of people who decided to sort of do their own thing. But I think in general, people have to get to a point to where they just decide to do something or they're just never going to do it at all. But for me, it was like feeling like I was ready before I could actually make it happen. And I thought that this would have happened like 7 or 8 years ago, me doing what I'm doing now. But I think it happened at the right time. It's unfortunate that it's happening in like a really tough market where fundraising is like really hard, but
Oh yeah.
It's
Unless there's
still
drinks, people ain't showing up.
right.
If it ain't a drink
Right.
involved or some good alcohol, they're not pulling up. They're like, what? No, wait. Is it a party or is it a fundraiser? No,
Yeah,
it's
and I
it's a
think
mix,
for
a mixture.
it's a it's a mixture of those. I think for like your audience who's listening, the benefit that people have if they have when they have a diverse background is just seeing things differently, and that's
Hmm.
a huge advantage, especially now in this market where differentiation is, I think, something that our culture or the U.S. culture is really starting to embrace. And when you think about the most successful tech founders in the United States ever, I think it was like 45 or 50% of them were immigrants to this country. It's like, that's not an accident. I think it's because they just see things differently. So,
Hmm. Hmm. And I just want to say, Kev, like, thank you so much for like all this insight that you've been dropping. You dropped some significant gems, and I greatly appreciate you just opening up and expressing like those hardships in your life, because those hardships obviously shaped you to the man that you are today, and it's helped you in your career. Through your journey, through your story, one thing that I see, which runs parallel to a lot of things you were saying, is that like how your mother said, like just not giving up. Like it's better to try than to just not try at all. I think that everything that came your way, you tried, and not only did you try, you actually were very successful at doing it. And I just appreciate you for just giving those words of advice to our listeners. And I just want to leave it off with this. If there's any words that you could share with, aspiring immigrant entrepreneurs who are looking to like start their journey, or maybe even start a unique path in the finance industry, what would you share with them?
I'll share probably the three things that I live by. If I were to write a book with three quotes on it, and these are all from people who personally had a big impact on me. The first one I would say is kind of what my mom said: it's better to try and fail than to not try at all. That's the first one. And I remember as a kid, my dad would always tell us, do the best with what you have. And basically, it's to keep an attitude of contentment and do the best with whatever situation you're in. And then the last one is an advice of action. I remember a person telling me, he was like, when you don't know what to do what you know. And that has always been something that has motivated me to take action and not sort of rest on my laurels or think that I need to know everything before I do something. So those would be the three quotes that I would leave for the listeners.
Mm, mm, mm. You gonna leave us off like that? you gonna you gonna leave? You out here living some punchlines, making us really think over it. Listeners, get your pens out, get your pads out, because Kevin is dropping some gems on the show today. Kevin, again, thank you so much for your time and just for your knowledge. And just for just like again, just your vibe. Like it's an amazing story journey, and I love connecting with you today.
No, appreciate the time and love to do it.
Yes, and I want to let the listeners know, if you want to hear more stories like Kevin, check us out on ZakaConnect.com or follow our feed, Zaka, wherever you listen to your podcasts.